diverse population of income levels within their buildings. So please vote yes on this 1159, but also be aware of who's really interested in quality, diverse housing for all income ranges in this program as you go forward over the next few years and work with the money coming from the Metro Bond. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this item, colleagues? Please call the roll.
Udaley?
Thank you for your report. I vote aye.
Fritz?
Very pleased with these changes. I'm happy to be able to remain in June, but and enthusiastically vote aye.
Fish? Aye. Seltzman? Aye. Williams?
I vote aye. The ordinance is adopted. Next item, please.
Item 1160, authorize the commissioner in charge of the
Because I'm getting
Police
tired
Bureau
of
to
hearing that
order
clicking sound.
content-neutral,
It interferes with my video.
time, place, and manner regulations for the demonstrations held in the city.
Colleagues, first I'd like to preview the roadmap for today's hearing and clarify a few items. First of all, I'm going to give a few brief remarks, then we'll have an informational presentation by the city attorney and the chief of police. Then we'll have some council discussion where I'll offer a substitute ordinance. The substitute ordinance, I will ask my colleagues at the end of the session to vote for, but I want to be very clear. By voting for the substitute ordinance, all they are agreeing to do is put the ordinance on the table for discussion. So it may be that a colleague would choose ultimately not to support this legislation, this ordinance, but I will ask them to vote aye to put the substitute ordinance on the table for further discussion. The substitute ordinance, which was released yesterday, includes some proposed revisions based on input from my colleagues as well as others in the community. I'll ask my fellow commissioners who have any amendments to put those amendments on the table. We will then hear invited testimony. After invited testimony, we'll hear public testimony. Due to concerns about quorum and scheduling at 5 p.m., I'll ask the council to discuss and vote on the substitute ordinance. And again, that means just putting it into the record as the ordinance under discussion. And I will ask them to vote on the amendments. We will not be voting on the overall ordinance today. We've heard from a number of my colleagues who'd like to have time to reflect, to offer input based on any public testimony. So we will not be voting today. We will be moving it to second reading. We do plan on voting, as I said, on the substitute amendments, and we'll vote on them towards the end of the hearing before we lose the quorum. There will probably be a lot of people who would like to give public testimony. We will be losing at least one member of the council who has a important community event this evening. I will certainly stay, and if we have two other folks who are staying to keep the quorum, we'll keep taking public testimony. So with regard to my introductory remarks, I want to start off by stating the obvious. Portland is a vibrant, livable, and economically prosperous community. It's viewed that way by the rest of the nation, but it's also true that in recent months, we've become something of a magnet for folks who are either coming from outside the community or elsewhere with either a history of or an express intent to come to our community to commit acts of violence. Demonstrations have been increasing in frequency, and unfortunately, they've also been increasing in terms of the violence that we're seeing. This creates a danger to the demonstrators, it creates a danger to bystanders, and it increases the likelihood of risk to public property. It's also unfortunate that our city has gained national recognition for these increasingly frequent instances. It's bad for the reputation of the city and the brand of the city. There's no question that it has the potential to create a negative impact on travel and tourism and the economy overall. But I think more importantly, it makes people feel less safe in the community. I want to be clear that I understand that this ordinance is not a panacea to this issue. This ordinance would provide one more tool, along with enforcing existing laws, along with setting clear expectations about what is and what is not acceptable, along with helping to educate folks on how they can come and express their First Amendment rights freely and fully and remain safe at the end of the day. The major objection to this ordinance has been, at least what I've heard so far, is that we should enforce the laws that already exist on the books. I want to be clear. I agree with that completely. And we should also, as I say, continue to educate the public and establish clear expectations. These demonstrations, I believe, that we've seen, and this is just my personal opinion, are a reflection of the national dialogue that are playing out on our streets. Our response as a city and as a community serves as something of a Rorschach test on what our city values. And let's be clear, I hope all of us today can agree that we value expression and dialogue and that we reject violence. Much of the opposition that I've heard to this ordinance is reflective of the national dialogue that I just referenced. Some people believe that the ordinance goes too far and could potentially curtail First Amendment rights. That's certainly not my intention. Others have expressed concern that this ordinance doesn't go far enough in addressing the increasing presence of the alt-right in Portland specifically. As a city, we have not had all of the necessary conversations around race that are reflective in our values as a welcoming, inclusive, and sanctuary city. And that is certainly factored into this conversation as well. So that's a long way of saying I believe it's important that we acknowledge the context in which I'm introducing this proposed legislation. But understand that whatever we do to address the behavior has to be content neutral in order to be constitutional. This ordinance is not about ideology or speech. This is about public safety and preserving the right of peaceful demonstrators to assemble. What about the constitutionality? And I know there's a lot of questions about this. Freedom of speech and association are amongst the fundamental rights guaranteed and protected by the United States and the state of Oregon's constitutions. The City Council enthusiastically supports the exercise of these fundamental rights. The law also recognizes the need for reasonable, content-neutral time, place, and manner regulations to ensure that speech and assembly rights can be exercised safely and without significant disruption to the rights of other members of the public. For example, the United States Supreme Court has explained, quote, that even in a public forum, the government may impose reasonable restrictions on the time, place, or manner of protected speech, provided the restrictions are justified without reference to the content of the regulated speech, that they are narrowly tailored to serve a significant governmental interest, and that they leave open ample alternative channels for communication and information. Applying the Supreme Court standard, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld time, place, and manner regulations for demonstrations. As the Ninth Circuit Court explained, quote, no one could seriously dispute that the government has a significant interest in maintaining public order. Indeed, this is a core duty that the government owes its citizens. Further, once multiple instances of violence erupt with a breakdown in social order, a city must act vigorously and more extensively to restore order for all of its residents and visitors. Adding large numbers of police on the street might be the solution in some cases, but in other cases could lead to more intense violence. As the Ninth Circuit Court reasoned, quote, "We do not think that even the most vital First Amendment expressions can be said automatically to overcome the need of a city to maintain order and security for its residents and visitors in the face of violence," unquote. Similarly, under the Oregon Constitution's Article 1, Section 8, the Oregon Supreme Court has held that, quote, "Some burdens on expressive activities are permissible, such as time, place, and manner restrictions." As mayor, it's expected that I will do everything I can to uphold the public safety. We cannot deny the increasing rate of demonstrations and increasing violence. This ordinance seeks to remove violence from demonstrations and preserve the public's right to express speech meaningfully. This ordinance enacts reasonable, content-neutral, time, place, and manner regulations for demonstrations held in the city with the goals of protecting both freedom of expression for demonstrators and the safety of the entire community. This ordinance does not apply for any demonstrations for which a permit has been issued. What this ordinance functionally does is give us the ability to take preventative steps to ensure public safety by setting the rules of the road when we have advanced knowledge and we have stated what that advanced knowledge is that leads us to believe that there is a significant threat of violence. Jurisdictions around the country have similar protections. There are some basic ideals that we should be able to agree on as Americans. We don't tolerate violence in our streets. Violence is not and has never been a legitimate means to a political end. I will not allow continued planned street violence between rival factions to take place in Portland, Oregon. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our city attorney and the chief of police. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. My name is Robert Taylor. I'm Chief Deputy City Attorney. I would like to discuss just three things briefly, and then I'd be happy to answer your questions. The first is the purpose of this ordinance. And the purpose is to give the police commissioner a tool to issue time, place, manner regulations over demonstrations and counter demonstrations in the city when there are facts that make us believe that violence is likely. The main goal is to provide peaceful demonstrators and counter demonstrators the rules in advance. It has become clear, based on past demonstrations, that it's very difficult to manage these crowds on the fly the day of the event. And where we know that these are coming and we can plan in advance, this allows the police commissioner to let peaceful people know what the rules are so they can act accordingly. And then the police can focus their limited resources on those who are intent on not following those rules. This ordinance certainly assumes that if we give Portlanders the rules in advance, that they will follow those rules. And we are hopeful that this will give the police a tool, and the commissioner will, or the police chief will speak about this, an additional tool to help manage these demonstrations with the goal of reducing violence, increasing peaceful demonstrations, reducing arrests, and reducing lawsuits. The second thing I would like to talk about is how it would work. There are two main parts of this policy in the ordinance. The first is in the directive talking about the criteria where the police commissioner could issue these written orders. And those criteria are there must be a history of violence between groups, and the safety of participants and bystanders is at risk. And third, there is a substantial likelihood of violence based on statements or conduct of those groups indicating an intent to do violence or other credible information from law enforcement.
Can I just note for the record, Mayor, that the city attorney has just set forth a standard that is in your substitute, but it was not in the ordinance originally filed. So, and the key that I see on page, for those of you following this at home, on page 5 of the original ordinance, paragraph 10C,